I've been watching what's happening in Washington these days, and, well, I've got to tell you, it's something else. It really is. I've seen a lot of presidencies come and go in my time. Republicans, Democrats, landslides, squeakers, scandals, resignations. I've seen markets crash, recover, crash again, and then climb to heights nobody thought possible. But what we're watching right now, with this emergency impeachment move against Donald Trump, this is not what anybody had penciled in for 2025. Not really. And I don't say that lightly. Look, I've always tried to stay out of the political arena. People who know me, they'll tell you. I don't run campaigns. I don't write slogans. I read balance sheets. I look at cash flows, not campaign ads. But when politics starts shaking the foundations of markets, when it puts real pressure on investor confidence, when it injects the kind of uncertainty that keeps CEOs staring at the ceiling at 3 inches the morning, well, then I think it's worth talking about. And what we're looking at now, it's worth talking about. What was supposed to be a tough but manageable second Trump era. A bumpy road, sure, but still a road, has turned into something very different. We're not just talking about routine investigations, normal partisan fights, the usual background noise that markets are perfectly capable of ignoring. We're talking about something far more serious. A rapid-fire impeachment push, triggered not at the slow, grinding pace Washington usually works in, but as an emergency move. After a series of revelations and internal fractures, that even seasoned observers didn't expect to see this soon. And on top of that, you've got a cabinet that looks less like a team and more like a fault line. Public loyalty, private panic, leaked memos, anonymous briefings. You stack all of that together, and it paints a picture that's hard to ignore. A presidency that isn't just embattled, it's structurally unstable. Now, I want to be clear about something. This impeachment drive didn't start out of nowhere. These moments never do. They're not lightning bolts from a clear blue sky. They're the last crack in a wall that's been under pressure for a long time. People like to say, it all happened so fast. But if you step back, you see the pattern. For months, maybe years, there have been investigations, committee hearings, whispers of lines crossed, and powers stretched. Legal teams working overtime. Staffers rotating in and out like a revolving door. Cabinet secretaries contradicting each other, sometimes within the same week. And all that time, markets have been watching, nervously, quietly. They may not care about the daily noise of politics, but they care very much about one thing. Can the system still function? What turned this from normal chaos into emergency impeachment wasn't a single headline. It was the cumulative effect of too many shocks, too close together, aimed at institutions that were already strained. You had new disclosures that raised serious questions about how far executive authority had been pushed. You had internal cabinet discussions leaking out. Talk of 25th Amendment consultations, talk of resignations, talk of senior officials documenting their concerns in real time. You had intelligence and defense officials quietly signaling discomfort with how decisions were being made, or in some cases, not made at all. Then came the tipping point, a set of actions seen by key members of Congress, not just as controversial, not just as partisan, but as dangerous to the functioning of government itself. At that moment, impeachment stopped being a political talking point and became a procedural weapon. Not should we, but can we afford not to? Now, you can agree or disagree with how they see it. That's not my job. My job is to look at what happens next. Here's what worries me. From a business perspective, a president facing a standard investigation is one thing. A president facing a formal, rushed, emergency impeachment while his own cabinet is showing visible cracks. That's a very different level of uncertainty. In one scenario, the system feels stressed, but controllable. In the other, it feels like the brakes might fail. Right as you're going downhill, you've got cabinet officials publicly declaring loyalty and privately shopping for lawyers. You've got senior aides trying to keep normal policy processes moving, while entire agencies are distracted by subpoenas and testimony prep. You've got foreign governments reading every headline and asking themselves a very simple question. Can the United States still make and keep long-term commitments right now? That's not a theoretical question. That's trade deals. That's defense agreements. That's sanctions enforcement. That's currency stability. And when they're unsure about the answer, they start quietly hedging. They look for backup plans, alternative partners, independent arrangements. All of that has a price. And sooner or later, markets pay it. People sometimes think markets only react to numbers, interest rates, unemployment, earnings, inflation. But underneath those numbers is something much more fragile. Trust. Trust that contracts will be honored. Trust that rules won't change overnight. Trust that institutions will hold up, even if leaders don't. This emergency impeachment moment targets that trust in a way we haven't quite seen before. Not just will the president stay in office, but who is actually in charge of the day-to-day machinery of government? Because here's the uncomfortable truth. When a cabinet is seen as being on the edge of collapse, when people start asking who might resign, who might flip, who might cooperate with investigators, you don't just have a political drama. You have a governance risk, and governance risk is economic risk. Now, I'm not predicting the end of the republic here. The United States has survived plenty of storms, wars, assassinations, resignations, recessions. The system is tough. It bends a lot further than people expect before it breaks. But bending has consequences. And right now, the bending is extreme. You've got a president fighting on three fronts at once: in the courts, in Congress, and inside his own administration. You've got a cabinet caught between self-preservation and public loyalty. You've got a Congress that's half prosecutor, half partner, depending on the day. And you've got an electorate watching all of this, tired, confused, angry in some cases, numb in others. That's not a formula for stability. That's a formula for volatility. From where I sit, this emergency impeachment push doesn't just raise the question, what happens to Trump? It raises a deeper one. How much stress can the system absorb before key actors, markets, allies, institutions, start changing their behavior in ways that are hard to reverse? Because once behavior changes, once capital moves, once alliances shift, once faith in predictability weakens, You don't simply flip a switch and go back to normal. When you strip away the headlines and the shouting and the scrolling banners, what this really comes down to is one thing: confidence in continuity, not confidence in a person, not confidence in a party, confidence that the lights stay on, the rules stay roughly the same, and the people in charge of key decisions are actually able to make them. This emergency impeachment push puts that continuity in question in a very direct way. Because normally, even in a contentious presidency, you have three assumptions holding the system together. The president will remain in office unless there's a slow grinding process to remove him. The cabinet will function as a stabilizing layer, smoothing the rough edges behind the scenes. Congress will argue loudly, but eventually cut deals to keep the government and the economy moving. Right now, all three of those assumptions are under strain at the same time. Let's start with the presidency itself. An impeachment inquiry is one thing. We've seen those before. They create headlines. They suck up oxygen, but they follow a familiar script. An emergency impeachment vote, though, rushed, accelerated, with cabinet discussions and internal memos being pulled into the spotlight. That feels less like a procedure and more like a scramble. Markets don't like scrambles. They can handle ugly. They can handle noisy. What they really struggle with is ambiguity about who is actually steering the ship. When CEOs call me and ask, "Warren, what do you make of all this?" They're not asking if I like or dislike Trump. They're asking something far more practical. Do we plan for one set of policies for the next 4 years? Or do we plan for 3 different possible governments in the next 12 months? That kind of question freezes decision-making. You don't break ground on a new factory if you have no idea what trade policy, tax policy, or regulatory posture will be in place when it opens. You don't commit billions of dollars in capital when you suspect the rules of the game might be rewritten mid-match. So what do? You wait. You hold back. You trim risk where you can. And when enough people do that at once, an economy that looked fine on paper suddenly feels sluggish. Now, let's talk about the cabinet. People underestimate how important that group is to market psychology. The president speaks. The cabinet runs. They translate big statements into actual rules, actual enforcement priorities, actual budgets. When a cabinet is viewed as strong, competent, and united, investors can tolerate a lot of noise at the top. They say, yes, it's dramatic, but the grown-ups in the room are keeping the machinery moving. But when that same cabinet is rumored to be on the brink of collapse, when you have reports of shouting behind closed doors, draft resignation letters circulating, private conversations about loyalty versus legality, then the backstop starts to crumble. We're hearing stories of senior officials quietly consulting their own lawyers, not about policy, about personal exposure. You don't get that in a stable administration. And when the people in charge of defense, justice, treasury, foreign policy start worrying about their own legal footing, their focus shifts. They're no longer primarily asking, what's best for the country? They're asking, what protects me if this presidency implodes? That's not a criticism. That's human nature. But it has consequences. Decisions get slower. Risk-taking at the policy level drops. Everyone looks for ways to avoid being the one caught holding the bag when the music stops. From a market perspective, that feels like a system moving in defensive crouch. Then you layer Congress on top of this. You've got one faction driving impeachment as fast as they can, arguing that delay itself is dangerous. You've got another faction calling it a coup in slow motion, saying it's an attempt to overturn an election through procedure instead of ballots. And in the middle of that, you still have to fund the government, still have to raise the debt ceiling, still have to pass basic legislation to keep things functioning. When impeachment becomes the only language anyone speaks, everything else gets harder to do. Now, as an investor, I don't need Washington to be pretty. I've made money in periods where the town looked like a circus, but what I do need is a basic expectation that the bills get paid and the laws get passed, with enough predictability that businesses can plan ahead. When impeachment talks start colliding with budget timelines, when one side hints that they're willing to use the economy itself as leverage in a political fight, that's when the risk premium changes. You see it in bond yields, you see it in credit spreads, you see it in volatility measures. They don't scream at first. They just start to whisper. Something here may not be as safe as it used to be. There's another piece of this that nobody on television likes to talk about very much, but it matters a great deal. Impeachment isn't just about whether a president stays or goes. It's about what gets exposed along the way. Documents, emails, conversations, private assurances that contradict public statements. For markets, this drip, drip, drip is often more damaging than the vote at the end, because every new revelation raises fresh questions about what else has been hidden, what else has been stretched, what else might still come out. We went through a version of this in the past with corporate scandals. It wasn't just the fraud itself that hurt markets. It was the feeling that you didn't know which balance sheets you could trust anymore. Now we're seeing a similar pattern at the level of government. If the impeachment hearings start pulling cabinet deliberations, classified briefings, and legal opinions into the open, we may learn things that shake confidence in how decisions were made over the last few years. And markets don't like being told after the fact that the reality behind the curtain was worse than the show out front. People ask me, Warren, is this like Watergate? Is this like Clinton's impeachment? Is this like anything we've seen before? And my honest answer is, no, not really. The names are different. The charges are different. The circumstances are different. But more importantly, the context is different. We didn't have this level of global debt. We didn't have this level of geopolitical tension. We didn't have markets plugged this deeply into algorithms that react in milliseconds to spikes in fear. So when you layer an emergency impeachment on top of a highly leveraged, hyper-connected, speed-driven market structure, you get a very delicate situation. A single committee leak can move $1 trillion in minutes. A single cabinet resignation can light up trading desks in New York, London, Tokyo, before the public has even finished their morning coffee. That's new, and it's dangerous. So what do investors do? They don't go on television and announce that they're terrified. They rebalance quietly, a little more cash, a little less risk, a little more gold, a little shorter on certain maturities, a little more hedging around sectors tied directly to government spending and regulation. They don't panic. They reposition. And if this impeachment train keeps accelerating, if the cabinet fractures further, if we see more emergency sessions, more late-night announcements, more surprise testimonies, that repositioning will intensify. Not because the market hates Trump or loves him or cares about him personally at all, but because the market hates not knowing how the play ends. From where I sit, this is the question that matters most. Does this impeachment process lead to clarity or to a prolonged limbo where nobody knows who's in charge, what the rules are, or how long the uncertainty lasts? If it produces clarity, even painful clarity, markets can digest that. They always have. If it produces limbo, that's when you start seeing deeper damage. When a country goes through a political earthquake like this, the world doesn't just sit back with popcorn and watch. They adjust. They test. They probe. Because power abhors a vacuum, and uncertainty at the top of the American system looks like opportunity to a lot of people outside it. Let's start with foreign governments. I don't care if we're talking about Moscow, Beijing, Tehran, or anywhere else. They all operate with one simple rule. When your rival is distracted, you quietly move pieces on the board. Now, if you're a geopolitical strategist sitting in one of those capitals and you see the United States consumed with an emergency impeachment, cabinet turmoil, and round-the-clock legal warfare, you see a window. You don't necessarily start a war. That's crude and risky. You do smaller, sharper things. You push harder in negotiations. You stall on agreements that were almost done. You test red lines in small, deniable ways. You make offers to U.S. allies that sound just a little more attractive than they did last year. You understand that America's attention is not on the long game right now. It's on survival mode in Washington. And survival mode at the top often means drift everywhere else. U.S. allies notice this too. They're not dumb. They read the same headlines. They get the same intelligence briefings, sometimes before your nightly news does. So when they see an impeachment process accelerating, cabinet members lawyering up, Congress on fire, they quietly ask themselves, if something big happens in our region, next year or the year after, can we count on Washington being fully present, or will it be busy arguing with itself? Again, they won't say that at a press conference. They'll say it in private, and the answer they give themselves shapes decisions you may not hear about for years. Buying more weapons from other suppliers, building alternative trade routes, moving a little more of their reserves out of dollars, signing deeper deals with powers that don't rely on U.S. leadership to function. Each move is small. None of them sounds like a headline. But over time, they add up. And that erosion, that slow, steady diversification away from reliance on the U.S. that matters to markets much more than loud speeches about eternal alliances. Now, let's talk about the banking system, because banks are like nervous animals. They don't scream, they flinch. They sense pressure long before the public does. Banks hate two things above all: not knowing who's in charge, not knowing what the rules will be, An emergency impeachment with a fractured cabinet hits both nerves at the same time. If you're a bank CEO, you're thinking along these lines. Will the next Treasury Secretary have the same stance on regulation? Will the Justice Department change enforcement priorities midstream? Will sanctions policy flip because a new team takes over? Halfway through a critical exposure, will we be asked to help stabilize markets in one scenario and punished for the same behavior in another scenario? That kind of uncertainty doesn't necessarily cause an immediate crisis, but it does change behavior. You tighten lending standards a notch, become a little more cautious on riskier credits, hold a little more liquidity, pull back from borderline exposures that might draw regulatory attention under a different political climate. And when a whole sector does that at once, you get what I'd call a credit chill, not a freeze, not a collapse, just a chill, but a chill at the wrong time can nudge an already fragile economy a few degrees closer to recession. Investors remember 2008 a lot more vividly than they admit. They remember what happens when confidence disappears from the banking system. So when they see impeachment hearings, cabinet fractures, threats to government funding, and policy made by late-night press conference, they don't wait for the official crisis label. They build in what we'd call a political risk premium. You see it as higher yields on certain bonds, lower price to earnings on certain sectors, more volatility around key dates, like impeachment votes, court rulings, or budget deadlines. None of that means the system is about to collapse tomorrow morning. But it does mean that money is no longer treating U.S. political risk as a rounding error. And that's new. Now, people sometimes ask me, Warren, in a moment like this, what do you do with Berkshire? It's a fair question, because Berkshire isn't just a stock. It's a big, diversified, real-world machine. Railroads, utilities, insurers, manufacturers, retailers, and of course a very large pile of cash, sitting ready for when the world panics. A little too hard. So let me walk you through how I'd think about it. First, I don't wake up and say, impeachment, sell everything. That's not how you build a 60-plus year track record. What I do instead is look at 3 layers. Core businesses. Are people still going to need energy, rail transport, insurance, consumer goods, regardless of who's in the Oval Office? Yes, 100%. Financial conditions. Are we heading into an environment where credit gets tighter, volatility rises, and some companies find they can't roll over their debts so easily? Very likely. Opportunity set. Will there be businesses with strong fundamentals, but temporarily depressed prices because markets can't separate political noise from long-term value? Absolutely. So what do you do when you see that combination? You prepare, you wait, and you act selectively. Preparation means you don't go out on a limb right before things get bumpy. You don't load up on leverage. You don't bet the farm on a single narrative about how the impeachment will end. You make sure you have more cash than you strictly need. You make sure your own balance sheet could handle a storm. We've done that for years at Berkshire. People complain that I hold too much cash. They say it drags on returns. They're right, until the storm hits. When the world is calm, excess cash looks lazy. When the world panics, excess cash looks like power. Waiting means you don't confuse motion with progress. Just because screens are flashing red, just because cable news is yelling, just because everyone online is predicting doom or salvation, depending on which party they support, that doesn't mean you have to do anything today. Sometimes the smartest move is to watch. Watch which sectors crack first. Watch which companies start warning about guidance. Watch which balance sheets suddenly look weaker when credit gets a little more expensive. Patience is not a lack of strategy. It is the strategy. When the future path is foggy, acting selectively is the final step. When impeachment risk, cabinet risk, and economic risk all get priced into stocks indiscriminately, you start to see mispricings. A business whose fortunes genuinely depend on cozy access to Washington probably deserves a bigger discount. In a moment like this, a business that sells essentials to Main Street families for the next 50 years probably doesn't. But markets don't always make that distinction, especially when emotion runs high. So you look for companies with little direct exposure to political decisions, companies with clean balance sheets, companies whose products or services are not optional luxuries, companies whose management teams have proven they know how to navigate storms. And when those go on sale, purely because investors are scared, in a general way, that's when Berkshire moves. Not recklessly, not frantically, calmly. All of this brings us back to the same uncomfortable truth. This emergency impeachment is not just about one man's fate. It's about how long the uncertainty lasts, how much institutional damage is done along the way, and how deeply confidence gets shaken in the process. The legal system will do what it does. Congress will do what it thinks it must. The cabinet will make its own calculations, but markets are already running the math on a different question. How do we protect capital if this drags on longer than anyone expects? And that, more than any speech, any rally, any viral clip, is what will shape the next year. For investors, if you really want to understand how fragile this moment is, you can't just look at the big speeches or the final impeachment vote. You have to zoom in on what happens around the key moments, the late-night leaks, the emergency press briefings, the cabinet no comments, the surprise subpoenas, because markets are no longer slow, thoughtful creatures that digest information over weeks. Their nervous systems wired directly to headlines. Picture this. It's a Tuesday afternoon. Markets are relatively calm. Traders are half focused on interest rates and earnings. Then a headline hits. Senior cabinet official cooperating with impeachment inquiry. White House blindsided. Within seconds, algorithms scan those words, match them against millions of past events, and start selling anything tied to political risk. Financial stocks twitch. Defense stocks flicker. Certain sectors tied to government contracts feel a sudden downdraft. A few minutes later, a rumor starts. Resignation letter drafted. Might be tendered within 24 hours. No confirmation. No clarity. But in a market this fast, You don't wait for confirmation. You price in the possibility. That's how you get these micro panics. Sudden spikes in volatility that look like someone turning the lights on and off. In a crowded theater, we've seen versions of this before, though never quite in this configuration. In 1974, the drip-drip of Watergate wore down confidence slowly. But markets and media moved at a very different speed. You had time to read the morning paper, think about it, talk it over, before anything big moved. In 1998, with Clinton's impeachment, you had scandal fatigue. People were exhausted, but the underlying economy was booming. The internet bubble was inflating. There was so much speculative energy that impeachment felt like noise to many investors. Today, very different mix. You've got a highly leveraged global system, algorithms trading on headlines, social media amplifying every rumor, geopolitical tension already elevated, and a political climate where both sides treat every institutional battle as existential. So when an impeachment goes from theoretical to emergency, it hits this hypersensitive wiring in a way that neither 1,974 nor 1,998 had to deal with. Here's the part people miss about volatility. It's not just a chart pattern. It's an emotion expressed in numbers. Every spike in volatility is a collective flinch. And when the flinches start coming more often, investors adapt. Long-only funds that pride themselves on stability start using more hedges. Short-term traders tighten their stop losses. Options markets start pricing in bigger swings around key dates, impeachment hearings, witness testimonies, cabinet announcements, Supreme Court rulings tied to executive power. All that hedging, all that protection buying has a side effect. It makes sudden moves worse when they finally happen. Because when everyone is braced for impact, small shocks don't feel small anymore. They feel like confirmation. Now, let's talk about something a little quieter, but maybe more dangerous. Moral fatigue. At the start of a scandal, people feel strongly. They pick sides. They argue. They care. But as the months go on, as impeachment grinds forward, as hearings pile up, the public starts to numb out. Instead of outrage, you get resignation. Instead of "this is shocking," you get "this again." For democracy, that's a serious long-term issue. For markets, it's a double-edged sword. On one hand, fatigue can dampen the emotional reaction to each new revelation. On the other hand, fatigue erodes the basic belief that the system can self-correct. People stop saying, "This is bad, but the institutions will fix it." They start saying, "This is bad, and maybe the institutions are part of the problem." That's where impeachment stops being just about a president and starts becoming a referendum on the whole architecture. And if investors begin to think courts are political, regulators are political, the central bank is political, and every agency is just one election away from being repurposed as a weapon, then you're not just trading earnings anymore. You're trading legitimacy. I've said for years that trust is the ultimate currency. You can have all the dollars in the world, all the technology, all the weapons, all the trade routes. But if people don't trust your contracts, your courts, your elections, your data, then the value of your paper, your promises, your bonds starts to fray. This is the deeper risk behind an emergency impeachment with a cabinet on the edge. It's not simply that Trump might stay or Trump might go. It's that in the process, we might grind down another layer of faith in how the American system works at all. Each side will say they're saving democracy. But if the public comes out of this believing that whoever loses will just try to impeach the winner next time, then we've turned an extraordinary mechanism into a routine weapon. And routine weapons get priced in. You start assuming every presidency will face some version of this level of warfare. You start assuming every major policy may be litigated, blocked, or reversed based on which party controls which chamber for which 2-year window. That's not fatal in 1 year, but over 10, 20, 30 years, it changes the premium investors assign to American stability. Let's come back to the cabinet for a moment, because this is where the brink of collapse language gets real. When cabinet officials begin to fear they might be dragged into legal jeopardy, they think in 3 time frames. Now, how do I get through this week without being forced to testify about something I never wanted to be part of? Soon. If the president survives, what happens to my reputation if I was too publicly loyal? Later, if the president falls, how will history and future employers judge what I did or didn't do? You can see why a lot of them suddenly fall in love with the word interim choices, acting secretaries, temporary arrangements. That fluidity at the top of key departments might not bother voters much. They've grown used to constant churn, but it bothers people who move serious capital. Because when you ask who sets energy policy, and the answer is, well, technically it's this acting person who may or may not be replaced, depending on whether this impeachment article passes and how 3 senators vote. You're not exactly filled with confidence to approve a 15-year, multi-billion-dollar project. So again, plans get delayed, decisions get smaller, time horizons shrink. Here's the irony I can't ignore. Impeachment is supposed to be a constitutional emergency brake used rarely, carefully, when normal politics can't handle the severity of alleged wrongdoing. But the way it's being used now, in a 24/7 hyper-partisan environment with emergency votes and cabinet fractures, it risks becoming something else, a recurring feature of American politics. And recurring emergencies aren't really emergencies anymore. They're business conditions. When the extraordinary becomes ordinary, you don't react with shock. You react with a new baseline. That baseline looks like lower long-term confidence, more frequent volatility spikes, slower capital formation, and a quiet shift of trust out of political promises and into hard assets, resilient companies, and cash. From an investor's point of view, the impeachment vote itself is not the end of the story. It's a data point. What matters far more is How many institutions look weaker afterward? How many officials resign in the fallout? How many norms are abandoned and then never rebuilt? How long does it take before markets feel that adults are back in charge of the basic machinery again? That timeline, not the cable news countdown clock, is what will determine how deep the scar tissue goes. When a country reaches this level of political saturation, where every hour feels like a new emergency, something subtle happens in the background, something people don't see until it's already reshaping the economy. The public stops caring, not in a cynical way, not in an angry way, in a tired way, a deeply, profoundly tired way. And that fatigue has consequences, because democracies aren't powered by perfection. They're powered by participation. They're powered by belief. They're powered by a sense, even a fragile one, that the system still works. When you burn people out, when you hammer them with crisis after crisis, without resolution, something breaks. Not loudly. Quietly, the public shift from outrage to shrugs. At the beginning of impeachment talk, people watch every update, argue every angle, share every clip. But by month 2, month 3, month 4, you start hearing different phrases. I'm tired of all this. Nothing changes. They're all the same. Wake me when it's over. That last one, wake me when it's over, is the most dangerous sentence in American politics, because when the public checks out, bad actors check in. Institutions that rely on scrutiny begin to drift. Decisions get made with less sunlight and more self-interest. And the long-term cost is trust, the one thing markets can't replicate with algorithms or pricing models. Two paths, and neither is clean. Now, let's look at the two outcomes everyone is whispering about. Path 1, the impeachment fails. Trump survives. He's still in office. The cabinet fractures, but he stabilizes the ship, just enough to keep moving. The short-term reaction from his supporters would be jubilation, a victory lap, a sense of vindication. But markets react differently, because failure does not end the uncertainty. It extends it. If the impeachment fails, you get a strengthened but cornered president, an even more polarized Congress, state-level investigations intensifying, constant legal landmines ahead, a cabinet filled with loyalists instead of stabilizers, and a country that now believes impeachment is a partisan tool, not a constitutional one. That's political fuel, but it's economic poison. And for markets, that means volatility doesn't fade. It accelerates. Why? Because investors know something critical. A wounded president with power is far harder to predict than a triumphant one or a removed one. Uncertainty grows. Policy becomes improvisational. Regulation becomes retaliatory. International partners lose patience. The chaos continues, but without the pressure valve of an impeachment process to absorb some of the force. Path 2, the impeachment succeeds. This is the path no one really wants to talk about, because it forces the country to stare into a constitutional mirror it hasn't looked at since Nixon. If the impeachment succeeds, you don't get stability the next morning. You get shock, pure shock. You get millions of supporters convinced the system is rigged, millions of opponents convinced democracy was saved, a transition of power under clouded legitimacy, cabinet resignations, lawsuits challenging the validity of the process itself, and several states threatening political retaliation in Congress. Markets don't like shock. They price it like a heart attack, fast, wide, and with assumptions that things may get worse before they get better. This path could produce a few days of extreme volatility and possibly a multi-week correction. But, and this is important, if the transition stabilizes, if the new leadership is steady, if the cabinet is rebuilt with credible figures, confidence begins to return, slowly, carefully. But return it does. Investors don't need perfection. They need predictability. If impeachment succeeds and the system shows it can manage the aftermath, markets will treat the disruption as painful but repairable. The hidden variable, investor patience. Investors aren't just watching impeachment votes. They're watching behavior. Are companies delaying hiring? Are CEOs pausing major investments? Are banks tightening without saying it publicly? Are foreign funds quietly shifting out of U.S. assets? Are bond spreads widening, even without economic data changing? These subtle signs always appear first. When confidence is evaporating, you can hide political weakness behind strong speeches. You can't hide it from credit markets. Credit markets know when leadership is fractured. They know when institutions are wobbling. They know when the system feels fragile. And right now, credit markets are behaving like something big is coming. Not tomorrow morning, not necessarily next week, but soon enough for them to start bracing. Buffett's core point patience is a strategy. This is where my voice, Warren Buffett's voice, has been consistent. Don't be reckless. When the world is uncertain, don't chase euphoria. Don't panic into fear. Stay liquid. Stay rational. Stay prepared. Patience isn't sexy. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't get applause. But it wins. Because patience lets you survive the storm and then buy when everyone else is too scared to think clearly. In a moment like this, the smart investor isn't asking, is the president guilty? Is the impeachment fair? Whose side is right? The smart investor is asking, how long will this uncertainty last? How deep will the scar tissue go? Which companies remain solid, no matter who sits in the Oval Office? Because in the long run, that's what actually matters.